There is a moment in every presidency, and I remember mine vividly, where you realize the person sitting across the table from you is not actually negotiating. They are waiting for you to talk yourself into a corner, waiting for the deadline you invented to become your problem instead of theirs. I watched that happen to better strategists than me, and I have been watching it happen again this week in broad daylight, on camera, to the current President of the United States. And the part that ought to alarm you is not that it is happening, it is that he does not appear to know it is happening. So I want to walk through what is actually going on right now, honestly and carefully, because this is one of those weeks where three different stories are all telling you the same thing if you know where to look. It is Friday, March the 27th, 2026. We have the Iran situation, where the distance between what is being claimed and what is actually occurring has grown into something genuinely dangerous. We have a landmark jury verdict against Meta and YouTube that could reshape the entire architecture of social media. And we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s public health crusade running headfirst into a wall of political reality. We need to talk about all three. And toward the end, I am going to show you how these seemingly different stories connect to the same deeper problem. So let us get right into it. On Wednesday, President Trump extended his deadline for striking Iran's energy infrastructure by another 10 days, pushing it to April the 6th. Now, on the surface, that sounds like de-escalation. It sounds measured. The previous deadline, set just days earlier, was about to expire on Friday. And Trump framed this extension as a response to an Iranian request for more time. They asked for 7 days, he said on Fox News. I gave them 10 because they gave me ships. Let me tell you something. When I was negotiating with difficult counterparts, and I had plenty of them, the one thing you never do is publicly narrate a version of events that the other side can immediately and publicly contradict. Because once that happens, you are no longer negotiating, you are performing. And performance without substance in the Middle East gets people killed. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has stated plainly that no direct negotiations are taking place. What Iran acknowledges is that messages have been received through intermediary countries. Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey have separately approached the United States offering to mediate. That is a fundamentally different thing from what Trump described in his cabinet meeting on Thursday, where he painted a picture of an eager, almost grateful Iranian leadership sending him presents and begging for terms. The 15-point framework that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed was transmitted to Iran through Pakistan. Well, Tehran rejected it. They sent back a 5-point counterproposal of their own. Think about that for a moment. If you send someone a list of demands and they send back a completely different list, that is not a negotiation that is going very well. That is two countries exchanging opening positions with an ocean of daylight between them. Here is the honest truth. Most people think this is just Trump being Trump, exaggerating for effect, talking big to keep the stock market calm. In reality, something much more consequential is unfolding. While the president builds a fantasy narrative about grateful Iranians sending oil tankers as gifts, Iran is quietly and methodically consolidating control over one of the most strategically critical waterways on Earth. Now, I want to be fair. Previous deadline extensions did briefly settle markets. Oil prices dipped, stocks bounced. But this time, the S&P 500 dropped 1.74% on Thursday, its worst single-day decline of 2026. Brent crude rose past $108 a barrel. Emmanuel Cao, who runs European equity strategy at Barclays, put it plainly to the Financial Times. The constant reversals and headline exhaustion, he said, are eroding the power of Trump's reassurances to stabilize markets. Wall Street, in other words, has caught on. And we will come back to why that matters economically for ordinary families. Because the grocery store consequences of a $108 barrel of oil are not abstract. They are going to land on kitchen tables across this country and across the world in the coming weeks. But first, I need you to understand what Iran is actually doing while all this theater plays out. Iran's parliament is moving to formalize a fee structure for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Foreign Minister Arakchi stated on Iranian state television that Iran exercises sovereignty over the strait, even if some might prefer to consider it international waters. He spoke about establishing permanent arrangements for safe passage going forward. Some vessels that have transited recently reportedly paid up to $2 million each for the right to pass. 3 ships that attempted to go through without authorization were warned they would be struck if they continued. They turned around. Let me tell you something. That is not the behavior of a country that has been, and I am using the president's own words here, obliterated. That is the behavior of a country that is setting up a toll booth on one of the world's busiest highways and daring anyone to drive through without paying. Roughly 1/5 of all globally traded oil and natural gas passes through that strait in peacetime, 20%. And right now, traffic has ground almost entirely to a halt. Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, said this week that the situation is worse than both the 1970s oil crises and the economic fallout from the Ukraine conflict combined. That is an extraordinary statement from someone not given to exaggeration. And here is what concerns me most. The longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to reverse. Every day that Iran operates a de facto toll system on the strait, every day that ships pay to transit under Iranian terms, that arrangement becomes a little more normalized, a little more entrenched. Iran is building an economic model around this. They are not stumbling into control of the strait, they are designing it. Meanwhile, at the cabinet meeting, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters that if Iran fails to accept the reality of the current moment, if they fail to understand that they have been defeated militarily, President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than they have ever been hit before. Now, let me ask you something. Does that sound like what you say when the other side is begging for a deal? Or does it sound like a threat you make when the other side has not budged? And then Trump himself told reporters, unprompted, that he is the opposite of desperate. I do not care, he said. We have other targets we want to hit before we leave. That is not strategic communication. That is a man trying to get ahead of a narrative he can feel slipping away from him. So where does this leave us? The honest assessment, and I wish it were different, is that America faces a situation with no clean exits. Nearly 2,000 people have been killed in Iran. 13 American service members have died. Amnesty International has called the threat to bomb power plants an open threat to commit war crimes. And any outcome where the United States eventually withdraws with Iran still controlling the strait will be recorded by history as a strategic defeat of enormous proportions. Most analysts agree that forcibly reopening the waterway would be extraordinarily costly in both blood and treasure, and even if achieved in the short term, may not hold. The American public, already strained by rising energy costs and economic anxiety, shows little appetite for the kind of sustained military commitment that would require. Now look, I am going to set Iran aside for a moment, because something happened this week in a California courtroom that deserves your full attention. And I think it connects to the larger question of whether our institutions are still capable of holding powerful actors accountable. On Wednesday, a jury in Los Angeles Superior Court found Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook and Google's YouTube, liable for deliberately designing their platforms to be addictive and for causing harm to young users. The plaintiff was a 20-year-old woman identified by her initials KGM. She began watching YouTube at age 6. She was on Instagram by age 9. By the time she was in her early teens, she had developed depression, severe anxiety, body image distortion, and suicidal thoughts. Her lawyers presented internal documents from Meta showing that executives were fully aware of the damage. One internal memo stated that 11-year-olds were 4 times as likely to keep returning to Instagram compared with rival platforms, even though the company's own policy required users to be at least 13. Another document said plainly, if we want to win big with teens, we must bring them in as tweens. Here is the honest truth. I have grandchildren, and when I hear that a company's internal strategy was to hook children before they were even old enough to meet the platform's own age requirement, that is not a failure of oversight. That is a business model built on exploiting children, and a jury of ordinary Americans saw it exactly that way. The jury awarded $3 million in compensatory damages and recommended another $3 million in punitive damages, split 70-30, with Meta bearing the larger share as the worst offender. Now, $6 million is pocket change for companies worth trillions, but that is not the point. The point is that over 2,000 similar lawsuits are currently pending. Legal experts are calling this social media's tobacco moment, the juncture where an industry that spent decades insisting it was completely innocent gets formally found to be deeply responsible for the harm its products inflict. Clay Calvert at the American Enterprise Institute said the verdict could open the floodgates of litigation. He said it will certainly trigger more. And it was not an isolated event. Just one day earlier, a separate jury in New Mexico ordered Meta to pay $375 million after finding the company knowingly harmed children's mental health and concealed information about child sexual exploitation on its platforms. That jury determined Meta engaged in unconscionable trade practices. 2 verdicts in 2 days. That is not a fluke. That is a pattern forming. Both companies say they will appeal. Meta called teen mental health profoundly complex and said it cannot be linked to a single app. YouTube argued it is a streaming platform, not a social media company. Let them make those arguments. What matters is that juries looked at the evidence, looked at the internal documents, listened to Mark Zuckerberg admit under oath that roughly 4 million users believed to be under 13 are on Meta's platforms in violation of its own rules, and they found those arguments unpersuasive. The question that should keep every parent and every lawmaker awake tonight is this. If the nature of these products is genuinely addictive, if the design features, the infinite scroll, the algorithmic recommendations, the autoplay, the notification bombardment, if all of that is built to create compulsive behavior, then what does a non-addictive version of these platforms even look like? Is it commercially viable? And what happens to these companies if courts force them to build it? We have got to remember that this is not just about courtrooms. It is about what kind of digital environment we are willing to tolerate for our children. And for the first time, institutions are starting to answer that question with real consequences. Now, speaking of institutions failing to protect public health, let us talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because his tenure as health secretary has become a case study in what happens when ideology collides with the practical requirements of governing. Let me tell you something. When Kennedy was brought on board, he was given unusual latitude. Trump reportedly had no particular interest in health policy, so Kennedy got a free hand to pick his own people at the agencies he oversees. That sounded like a good deal for Kennedy. It has turned out to be anything but. On Thursday, the administration missed the statutory deadline to nominate a permanent director for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The position has been vacant since last August, when Susan Menarez was confirmed to the job and then fired by Kennedy 29 days later. Her offense? She refused to pre-approve vaccine recommendations for the public, and she would not fire career scientists. Before her, Dave Weldon was nominated but proved too extreme on vaccines to secure Senate confirmation. So now Jay Bhattacharya, who is primarily the director of the National Institutes of Health, has been filling in. But under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998, without a new nominee advanced by the deadline, he can only perform what the law calls delegable duties. The full authorities of the director's office now fall to Kennedy himself, which would be comic if it were not so consequential. And here is the twist that most people have missed. Bhattacharya held a staff meeting this week and told CDC employees, and I want you to hear this, I think it is vital that every kid in this country get the measles vaccine. Absolutely vital. That is the acting head of the CDC having to reassure his own staff that the agency still believes in one of the most basic, proven, effective public health tools in human history. The fact that this statement was greeted with relief and even applause inside the building tells you everything about how far things have deteriorated. Staff reportedly described it as a first sign of possible return to normalcy. Most people think Kennedy's anti-vaccine campaign is fringe politics that does not affect them. In reality, measles outbreaks have produced 14 new clusters across the United States in 2026 alone, sickening more than 1,000 children, the vast majority of whom were unvaccinated. The past flu season was classified by the CDC as highly severe for children and killed more than 100 kids. These are not statistics. These are families burying children from diseases we had effectively conquered. And the political ground is shifting under Kennedy's feet. In December, Republican pollsters Tony Fabrizio and Bob Ward circulated a memo warning that vaccine skepticism is toxic at the ballot box. They found strong bipartisan support for routine childhood immunizations, even in the most competitive House districts. Their conclusion was blunt. Candidates who support eliminating long-standing vaccine requirements will pay a price in the election. The broader Make America Healthy Again platform polls well on food safety and agricultural chemicals. But on vaccines specifically, it is an outlier that most voters reject, even within the movement itself. The White House noticed. They began pressuring Kennedy to back off vaccine policy changes. They installed a new chief counselor, Chris Klomp, specifically to contain the damage. Kennedy stopped talking about vaccines in public and pivoted to posts about food pyramids and AI-generated videos of himself in a wrestling ring, because apparently that is where we are now. But the damage was already done. A federal judge in Massachusetts blocked Kennedy's attempts to overhaul the childhood vaccine schedule earlier this month, ruling that the changes were arbitrary and capricious and that a majority of the new vaccine advisory committee members lacked the qualifications required for their positions. All of their decisions were placed on hold. One of Kennedy's most prominent appointees to that committee, Dr. Robert Malone, abruptly resigned, claiming the judge had defamed him. Kennedy's nominee for Surgeon General, the wellness influencer Dr. Casey Means, cannot secure enough Senate votes for confirmation because of her positions on vaccines. Republican Health Committee Chairman Bill Cassidy, who voted to confirm Kennedy in the first place, has made clear he will not advance any more nominees from what he sees as the anti-vaccine wing. And then there is the glyphosate problem. Trump signed an executive order to boost domestic production of the herbicide, the active ingredient in Roundup. The manufacturer, Bayer, contributed $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund in 2024 and has spent $17 million lobbying on the chemical. For the Make America Healthy Again base, which considers glyphosate a poison, that was a direct betrayal. The very voters Kennedy was supposed to keep inside the coalition are now watching Trump side with the chemical industry over their core conviction. Let me close with this, and I want to speak not as a Democrat, not as a former president, but as someone who has watched this country navigate difficult periods before and still believes it can find its way through. What connects these three stories, the Iran situation, the social media verdicts, the unraveling of the anti-vaccine project, is a single thread. It is the distance between what powerful people say and what is actually true. Trump says Iran is begging for a deal. Iran says there are no negotiations. Tech companies said their products were safe. Juries in 2 states said they were not. Kennedy said he would make America healthy. Judges, scientists, and now Republican pollsters say his methods are dangerous and politically radioactive. The saving grace, and this is what gives me hope, is that the system still has mechanisms for calling out the gap. Juries still hear evidence and render verdicts. Judges still apply the law. Pollsters still measure what voters actually think. Scientists still insist on what the data shows. These institutions are under enormous strain. Some of them are badly damaged, but they are not gone. The story of this country has always been the story of ordinary people refusing to accept less than what they were promised. That has not changed. It cannot change, because the moment it does, everything else falls apart. We have been through worse. I have seen worse from inside that building. But we got through it because enough people in enough places decided that the truth still mattered more than the performance. And I still believe, I have to believe, that is who we are. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other this weekend, and God bless the United States of America.